There are rooms where everything goes wrong at once. Not the loud, explosive kind of wrong. That kind is almost easier because it announces itself and gives you something clear to fight. The kind of wrong that breaks rooms like the one on the Virginia coast that October night is quieter. It arrives as a cascade, one system failing, then the backup straining, then the backup to the backup discovering it was never truly a backup at all. Screens going from green to amber to red. Men who have handled individual crises standing very still, waiting for someone to tell them what to do when everything fails simultaneously. What they wait for in those moments is command, not rank, not a manual. Command, the thing that lives in a person's voice when they have spent years being the last decision in a room and have carried the consequences of those decisions and kept making them anyway. That night, in a room full of trained men, going still, the voice that cut through the noise did not belong to anyone they recognized. It belonged to a woman in jeans and a faded hoodie who had been standing near the door, watching in the way that certain people watch, not waiting for their turn to speak, but building a complete picture of a situation before they move inside it. She stepped forward. She spoke. Everyone moved. What she was doing in that room and who she was and what she had spent the preceding 7 days doing, while a base of nearly 3,000 people had no idea, that is the story. It begins 7 mornings earlier at a gate in the gray before dawn with a corporal who did not read the name on the ID card he was handed. He was not careless. He simply had no reason to look closely. That was exactly what she had planned on. The silver sedan came down the approach road to Naval Air Station Ironcliff, the way a vehicle moves when the driver is looking at things rather than moving through them, slowly enough to see. The road ran along the eastern fence line before turning into the main gate, and from that approach the base was visible in profile, the flight line to the north, the harbor piers to the south, the administrative cluster of gray buildings in the center that looked the same as every administrative cluster on every naval installation on the Atlantic coast, which is to say, they looked functional and not recently tended. She had seen hundreds of bases. She could read one from the outside the way a doctor reads a face in a waiting room. Not diagnosing, just noting, building the first layer of a picture that would become more detailed the closer she got. What the profile of NAS Ironcliff told her from a moving car at 0600 on a Tuesday in October, the cranes over the harbor piers were not moving, and the stillness was not the stillness of early morning. It was the stillness of equipment that had been idle long enough for small rust formations to appear at the pivot points. 2 vehicles were visible in the motor pool lot with their hoods open to the sky, not being worked on, just open, which is the position of vehicles waiting for parts that have not arrived. A bulletin board on the perimeter fence held notices that had curled at the corners. Nobody updates a bulletin board. They don't believe anyone reads. She pulled into the visitor's lane at the main gate and stepped out before the guard had a chance to wave her to the window. Jeans, a faded navy hoodie, the blue of it washed down to something closer to gray. Boots that had been good boots once and were still functional boots, but were not new and not polished and carried in their leather the specific record of distance, a rolled toe on the left, a scar at the right heel from a ship's deck cleat somewhere in the Western Pacific. She had carried those boots through 3 ocean deployments, through the narrow transit of a contested corridor in the Pacific under hostile surveillance, in tactical command of a strike group with 11 ships and the lives of 4,000 people indexed to her calculations, through windowless nights in Washington where the men with the most experience were not always the ones whose opinions survived the meeting. She had not brought her medals. Those were in a box in Norfolk. She had brought the boots in a single duffel bag and a cover identity that 3 people in Washington had spent 2 weeks constructing. Administrative transfer, logistics support, mid-grade officer, no flag indicators, nothing that would register as unusual to anyone processing a routine permanent change of station. Corporal Decker was 23 years old, 3rd month at the gate post, the kind of young man who had joined for reasons he could not fully articulate and was still determining whether those reasons had been sound. He took the ID card, glanced at the designation Administrative Transfer Logistics Support, and handed it back. He did not read the name carefully. There was no reason to. Behind him, 2 Marines leaned against the concrete barrier with coffee cups. One of them looked at her as she walked back to her car, said something to the other one. The laughter that followed drifted across the lot with the easy cruelty of men who are bored and have found a small target. She heard it. She kept walking, not because it didn't register, because it registered as information. Installations have personalities, and the personality is set in small interactions. The quality of attention at the gate, the way people use unstructured time, the things people find funny. This base had the looseness of a place that had been coasting long enough that coasting had become the institutional standard. Nobody here expected anything to be different. That expectation she knew from long experience was both the disease and the first thing that had to change. Rear Admiral Claire Donovan drove to the secondary parking lot and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel looking at the base she was about to command without anyone knowing she was about to command it. She had made the case for this approach in a meeting with 3 people at the Pentagon who had the clearance to hear it. A new commanding officer arrives with ceremony and full knowledge, and what she sees is performance. The parking lots are cleaned, the reports are polished. People who are struggling have been coached on what not to say. She would see the version they wanted her to see, and the version they wanted her to see was not what she needed to understand. What she needed was the version they showed each other when no one important was watching. She got out of the car and began to walk. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb ran the administrative function of NAS Ironcliff from a third-floor office that looked like the physical record of a man managing more than his systems could support. Files in stacks that had been organized at some point and added to since without reorganization. A desk calendar 3 weeks behind. A coffee mug that had developed a geological record from repeated use without washing. None of this meant Webb was a bad officer. It meant he was an officer in the specific condition produced by insufficient support over a sustained period, still functional, still trying, but operating in the compressed space between what was needed and what was available, and showing the signs of having operated there for too long. He finished signing a form before he looked up. When he did, he gave her a moment of genuine attention, the kind that sees a person rather than a category, and then something settled in his assessment, and he filed her away. Transfer clerk, logistics support, useful for a while, then gone. Monroe, he said, reading the name off the single-page orders. Welcome to Ironcliff. Logistics section. Major Keating. Yes, sir. Familiar with the new requisition system? I have some experience with it. Good, it's a mess. He reached for the next folder. Motor pool's frustrated. Comms is running at partial capacity. HQ wants readiness numbers I can't produce. Keating is sharp, but she's running on nothing. Don't add to her load. I won't, sir. He glanced at her, then half a second the look of a tired man registering a variable he cannot quite place. Something in her answer or in the economy of it had been slightly different from what he expected. Not wrong, just not what transfer clerks usually sounded like. It passed. He pointed her down the hall and went back to his forms. The logistics office announced itself before she reached it. Phones ringing, a printer in the repetitive distress pattern of a jam cleared and reformed. The low continuous sound of people working hard at tasks they had partly stopped believing would produce results. The room itself was dense with the evidence of a function bending under loads it had not been designed to carry, alone screens full of requisition tracking, boxes of unfiled forms along the walls, phone lines blinking with calls on hold. At the center of it was Major Sarah Keating, late 30s, hair in a bun that had abandoned its ambitions sometime mid-morning. Uniform pressed because she was the kind of officer who maintains the form even when the environment is working against it. The lines under her eyes were not recent. They were the lines of sustained effort unrewarded, which is a different kind of tiredness than exhaustion and more difficult to recover from. She moved through the room with a tablet in one hand and a folder in the other, tracking multiple variables simultaneously, not because she was remarkable at multitasking, but because the workload left no other option. She reviewed the orders. We lost 2 people to burnout last month and 1 to a promotion. Consider yourself in the deep end. From a desk near the window, Sergeant Kowalski leaned back and delivered a line that had clearly served him before. Nearby clerks produced the obligatory laugh. Keating turned a look on him that could have stripped paint. He straightened and found something to do with his screen. Claire sat down. She logged into the guest account. She pulled up the inbound requisition queue and began. She did not try to impress anyone. She did not offer opinions. She listened to Keating move through the room, the efficiency of someone who has learned to solve problems in the space of a doorway conversation. She watched Voss come in from the motor pool with a folder and the controlled anger of a man who has been making the same correct argument for long enough that the correctness of the argument has become its own humiliation. She watched a young communications technician arrive looking for a signature on a form that had been moving between departments for 2 weeks. He left with the form still unsigned. He did not look surprised. Through the window, the harbor below and the ships at berth and the cranes standing idle. Deferred maintenance, deferred deliveries, deferred everything. The compound interest of an institution that had gotten good at postponing. She had seen it happen before, and she understood its mechanics. It doesn't arrive as a single decision to lower standards. It arrives as a series of individually defensible decisions to defer, each one reasonable given the immediate pressure accumulating over months into a new baseline that people inside the institution adjust to without noticing the adjustment has been made. Then the baseline becomes invisible because it has been complete long enough, and the expectations built on it become invisible too, and the people working inside it are doing their jobs within a frame that has been warped without their awareness. You cannot fix that from the outside in. External pressure produces defensive performance, the version of readiness that looks correct to inspection and dissolves the moment the inspector leaves. The only fix that holds is finding the people who still believe the frame should be straight, and there are always those people buried under the weight of systems that have stopped supporting them and giving them conditions in which their belief becomes structural rather than personal. That required knowing who they were, which required listening and watching and asking the right questions and not announcing in advance that you were asking them. She met Staff Sergeant Danny Voss properly on the second day. Keating sent her to the motor pool with a stack of requisition forms that required a supply officer's physical sign-off. "If anyone gives you trouble, smile and wait them out," Keating said, which was the advice of someone who had sent people to Voss before and understood what they would encounter. The motor pool smelled of oil and hot metal and the accumulated honesty of work done on physical things that either function or don't. Voss stood in the middle of it with a clipboard and grease on his forearm, moving between stations with the authority of a man who knows exactly what is happening with every piece of equipment in his care and has strong opinions about who should be allowed to have opinions about it. He saw the forms, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man who has received exactly what he expected and is not pleased about it. "Let me guess," he said. "More promises from logistics that the parts are definitely coming this time." "Requisitions to confirm," she said. "If we get these signed today, they move up the chain faster." He took the forms, scanned the numbers, and pushed them back. He would not sign off on parts they didn't have, so someone at a desk could check a box. He had been clear about this before, and it had not produced results. And now here was another clerk from logistics who had not received the message, or had received it and been sent anyway, which in his experience was worse. He looked at her badge. "You look new. Here's a tip: don't touch fleet vehicle documentation unless you understand what happens when those vehicles don't move." A couple of mechanics nearby registered this in the way that people register a familiar performance they have been waiting for. She did not flinch. "I'm not asking you to certify anything untrue. I'm asking what you need on paper so we can stop pretending the parts are somewhere they're not." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one that came before it. Voss was looking at her with the assessment of a man deciding whether this was a new obstacle or something that didn't fit the category he had prepared. "Accurate status on back orders," he said finally. "Not optimistic estimates. And someone to stop letting supply mark items as in transit when they've been in transit for 4 weeks. A vehicle sitting dead on this lot isn't just a number. It's a mission that won't launch." "Then let's start there," she said. He grumbled. He took the forms back and made careful margin notes, refusing to certify anything he couldn't verify, and specifying precisely what he needed. It was not the signature she had come for. It was more useful than that. On her way back through the office, a clerk deposited a folder on her desk with more force than necessary. "If you've figured out how to make the new system work," the woman said, the word work edged with something, "feel free to share with the rest of us." "I'll let you know when I've qualified for sainthood," Claire said. "Until then, I'll settle for getting the motor pool its replacement radios before month's end." She said it without heat, without performance. Just the simple statement of an intention. The clerk looked at her for a moment, uncertain what category to assign it to, and went back to her screen. She spent her evenings in the empty office. This was partly practical. The accumulated backlog was real, and someone with the ability to address it should. But it was also something else. Empty institutions at night tell a different truth than institutions during the day. In the day, people perform their relationship to the organization they work for. At night, the organization is just itself, its systems, its gaps, its actual condition, stripped of the overlay of human management. Seaman First Class Aaron Walsh found her on the 4th evening with the expression of a man approaching a decision he had not fully committed to. He was 22 years old, which is old enough to understand when you are drowning and not old enough to reliably distinguish between your own incompetence and the incompetence of the system you're drowning in. He stood at the edge of her desk and explained it carefully. Data entries in conflict. The new system flagging errors in the old data. Every correction producing more flags, 2 weeks of late nights, and the backlog growing rather than shrinking. He thought he had caused it. He was afraid to tell Keating how far behind he was. "Show me," she said. She moved her chair to his station, and they worked. Not briefly for 3 hours, tracing the error patterns from their actual source outward. It didn't take long to identify the mechanism, a set of transition protocols in the training materials that described a procedure the actual system didn't follow. Walsh had been executing the instructions precisely. The instructions were precisely wrong. Every error in his queue traced back to that mismatch, compounding through the data, the way a small navigational error compounds over distance until you are nowhere near where the chart said you would be. She built him a checklist, specific, sequential, calibrated to the actual system behavior, rather than the documented version of it. By midnight, the worst of the backlog was under control. He sat back and rubbed his face. "You didn't have to stay." "I know. Most people say figure it out, or they tell the major you're slow." She looked at him directly. "You weren't slow. The map was wrong. Those are different problems with different solutions." He sat with that. "Keep the checklist," she said. "You're better at this than 2 weeks of bad documentation made you think." She meant it as a practical observation. She watched it land as something more than that, the return of a belief a person had been slowly surrendering without anyone noticing it was leaving. She sent him home and turned back to the screen, and it was then tracing the routing codes in the supply chain entries to verify the data corrections were holding that she found the first wrong thing. It was not a formatting error, it was a destination code. She had spent enough years in operational contexts where logistics data was tactical intelligence to read destination codes the way other people read addresses. These codes pointed to a civilian logistics facility in Norfolk, Virginia. Not a contractor working under military agreement, a private commercial address. She cross-referenced it against the base's vendor registry. Nothing. She went back through the quarter's entries. The same destination code appeared in 8 separate supply records, each individually marked routine, each individually approved. Electronics packages, vehicle components, communication relay hardware, each approved by the same signature, Captain Gerald Strand, supply officer. $2,300,000 in military hardware, 18 months, one address. She memorized what she needed and closed the screens and sat for a long moment in the empty office. Outside, the harbor lights made broken shapes on the water. Then she went further back. She searched personnel records for complaints filed against the supply section in the previous 12 months. 2 names appeared: Petty Officer Brackett and Specialist Marlowe. Both had filed informal reports 10 months prior. Both described anomalies in supply routing. Both named destination codes that matched what she had just found. Both had been transferred off NAS Ironcliff within 72 hours of filing. Their reports had not been processed, reviewed, or forwarded. They had simply ceased to exist in the system, which is something documents do when someone with the right access removes them from the queue before they reach review. Strand had authority over his section and considerable discretion over routing decisions that most supervisors did not examine closely. But he did not have the authority to arrange 2 personnel transfers in less than 3 days without a paper trail. Somebody else did. Somebody above Strand's level with visibility into the IG processing queue and the ability to act on what they saw there. She took out the plain civilian notebook. Not a government device, not anything that logged or reported, and wrote nothing about Strand. She wrote 3 names: Walsh, Hollins, Voss. She closed the notebook. Then she took out her personal phone and wrote 9 words to a number she had memorized and never stored. She sent the message and put the phone away. By morning, 2 new maintenance contractors would arrive at the base's hangar bay. Their credentials would pass inspection. They would do genuine maintenance work because cover that is 90% true holds better than cover that is entirely fabricated. They were not maintenance contractors. She stood at the window for a long time before she left, watching the harbor below settle into its nighttime configuration and thinking about a base that had been systematically damaged by someone operating from inside the authority that was supposed to protect it, and about the people inside that damage who had kept working anyway. Walsh building checklists in his head to solve problems that were not his fault. Keating pressing every day against a system that pressed back. Hollins submitting the same parts of requests into a queue that had been engineered to produce silence. She had come to Ironcliff to understand what was broken and begin the work of fixing it. What she had found was a break that had been deliberate and a depth of damage that extended upward through the chain of authority in ways she had not yet fully mapped. There was more to do before she was done with this week. She picked up her duffel and walked out into the October night, the boots making no particular sound on the pavement, the base dark and quiet around her, the harbor holding its light in long, still lines. She visited the communications hub on the afternoon of the fifth day. Ray Hollins met her at the door with the wariness of a man who has learned to be skeptical of people from logistics arriving with questions, because questions from logistics had historically produced nothing he could use. He was 43 years old and had 19 years of service, and the specific competence of someone who had spent those years developing expertise in a field that the institution he served had intermittently remembered to value and regularly forgotten to fund. He walked her through the hub with the efficiency of someone who has given this tour enough times to have stripped it to its essentials. Primary relay gear past recommended replacement. Backup racks assembled from scavenged components of older systems. Operational capacity at approximately 60% of specification. 6 months of critical parts requests submitted. None arrived. He pointed to a rack of equipment indicator lights in intermittent flutter. If one more component fails, we lose redundancy. One surge, one lightning strike, one bad afternoon, and this base goes deaf. Not inconvenienced. Deaf. What happens when you escalate? I've been escalating. His voice was level. It disappears. Someone marks it received or says, we're not in the highest risk category. On paper, we're stable. And off paper, we're a storm away from a problem that's going to be somebody else's emergency. She walked the line of equipment, reading model numbers and maintenance tags, noting the panels that had been retaped at their edges, the improvised bypasses that had become permanent fixtures. She asked for the part numbers he needed most urgently. He listed them. She wrote them in the civilian notebook, not as a logistics clerk covering a checklist, but as a commander assembling a damage assessment that was almost complete. She already knew where his parts had gone. She thanked him and left him to his work and walked back through the base in the afternoon light, with the picture complete in her mind, the full shape of what Naas Ironcliff was underneath what it had been made to appear to be. Word moved through Naas Ironcliff on the fifth day. Not announcement, there was no announcement. It moved the way information moves in closed communities, through the small circulations of people who have noticed something they cannot fully explain and are trying to locate it in a category they already have. It started with the tattoo. Late on the fourth evening, Claire had reached across her workstation for a pen, and her sleeve caught on the desk edge and rode 2 inches up her forearm. The mark that appeared for those seconds was not decorative. A trident faded to the blue-black of old ink carried without apology the outline of the Pacific Fleet Command Group, the mark of officers who had commanded at the highest operational level in that theater. Petty Officer Torres, working the desk beside her, stopped mid-sentence. "Ma'am, where did you get that?" She tugged the sleeve down. "Old mistake. Kept it to remember." He laughed in the uncertain way of someone who recognizes they may have stumbled onto something they don't have context for, and went back to his screen. By the following morning, 2 people in the section were finding reasons to look at her forearm when she wasn't watching them do it. The second incident was in the break room, where 2 sailors had been arguing the merits of competing Japanese port cities for long enough that the argument had become comfortable. They turned to her in the easy way of people who don't yet think of someone as significant. "You ever been out that way, ma'am?" She was pouring coffee. She answered in Japanese, not studied, not deliberate, but the organic rhythm of someone who had lived inside the language long enough that it lived inside them in return. Fluent idiomatic, carrying the cadence of Yokosuka in the vowels. Both men went quiet in the way of people receiving unexpected information. The older one, "You sound like one of the locals." She stirred her coffee. "Once upon a time." She walked out without looking back. The third incident happened on the flight line at 2200, when a young sergeant intercepted her with a flashlight and informed her she was not cleared for the line after 2300. She handed him her access card and quoted the relevant subsection of the Security of Operations Manual, the command-designated observer exemption from unassisted memory. Not reciting. Recalling the way a person recalls things they learned when those things were operationally relevant rather than administratively useful. The sergeant's flashlight wavered. He let her through. He watched her walk the length of the tarmac in the dark for a long time before he brought the beam back to his post. By morning, a tattoo that only ship commanders earned. Japanese spoken like a resident. Base security regulations recalled like a chief with 30 years. No explanation, no category that fit. And in the absence of explanation, A different quality of attention, not the dismissive glance of people who have already decided what someone is, but the careful observation of people who have discovered they may have been wrong about that. The joke stopped. She met Gerald Strand in the supply office on the fifth afternoon, carrying requisition forms that required his signature. A legitimate errand, a secondary purpose. She had spent 4 days building a picture of Strand from the outside, from his signatures, from the patterns in his approvals, from the two names that had been transferred off this base within 72 hours of writing his name down in the wrong context. She needed to see him from the inside to complete the picture. He was not what people imagine when they imagine someone doing what he was doing. Trim, organized. His desk was cleaner than Webb's, his uniform correct in the way that reflects genuine attention. He had an easy professional manner, the practiced warmth of someone who had learned early that trust extends most readily to people who project comfort in their own authority and who had built a career on the application of that lesson. He was on a call when she entered. He held up one finger. She waited. While she waited, she watched. Not his face, she was past reading faces. She watched his desk, the angle of his personal laptop screen, turned away from the door, the second phone sitting face down on the credenza behind him, the civilian shipping label in his recycling bin positioned with the imprecision of something placed rather than dropped. Small habits. The habits of a man managing something that requires sustained, consistent attention, where the consistency has been maintained long enough that he no longer feels the effort of maintaining it. He finished the call and gave her the half-minute of professional attention he gave to everyone who entered his space. He reviewed the forms, efficiently asked 2 clarifying questions, signed 2 and returned 1 with specific instructions for resubmission. Professional, unhurried. He registered her as exactly what her badge indicated. She thanked him and left. In the hallway, she walked at the same pace she had entered with. The picture was complete. Strand was not reckless. He was not desperate. He was a man in the middle of something long-running and well-managed, operating from the confidence of someone who has been in control of a situation long enough to trust that control as a permanent condition. That trust, she knew, was the most exploitable thing about him. The storm built over the Virginia coast through the afternoon of the 6th day with the methodical intention of Atlantic coastal weather, not sudden, not dramatic, but accumulating the pressure, dropping in the way that the body registers before the instruments confirm. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the specific green-gray of a system that means what it says. Inside the logistics office, the storm was operational rather than meteorological. Keating had been tracking the inbound supply aircraft all day. The manifest carried communication relay components that Hollins had been requesting for 6 months. Vehicle parts for 3 of Voss's deadline vehicles. Mission kits for units that had been working around their absence for too long. If the aircraft diverts, Keating said to the window rather than to the room, those items go into another base's inventory. Getting them back takes weeks and 2 levels of additional authorization. She paused. It's happened before. Claire kept working through the afternoon, tracking the incoming manifest line by line, ensuring every document in the delivery chain was clean and correctly coded, not to appear busy. Because if the aircraft landed and the paperwork had errors, the items would sit in receiving for days. Details mattered in logistics the same way they mattered everywhere, not in isolation, but in accumulation. Each small correct thing reducing the chances of a larger wrong one. At 1800, the first real gusts hit the building. At 1900, the lights flickered and stabilized. At 2000, Keating stepped out of her office with a phone in her hand and an expression that confirmed the thing she had been managing carefully had decided to become unmanageable. Save your work, she said. Monroe, with me. The covered walkway between the administrative building and the comm hub offered minimal protection from a storm that had decided to stop being theoretical. Rain came in nearly horizontal, driven by a wind with direction and intention. They moved quickly, and Claire entered the comm hub behind Keating into air that was several degrees too warm and carried the faint electrical smell of systems under load they were not rated to carry. The screens were yellow and red. Holland stood near the main console with a headset around his neck, and the jaw of a man who had been anticipating this conversation and did not intend to waste time on it. Primary antenna array down to half capacity from a voltage surge. The backup system, the one assembled from scavenged parts, was choking under the transferred load. The inbound aircraft was on approach with fuel margins that made diversion uncomfortable and made the alternate considerably worse. Tower contact with the aircraft was intermittent. Sometimes they could hear, sometimes they couldn't. What's the physical state of the backup chain? Claire asked. Hollins looked at her. I've been running diagnostics. Diagnostics read a system under surge, she said. The physical condition of the components may not match what the diagnostics are reporting. I need eyes on it, not software. A beat the beat of a man processing a question that doesn't fit the category he assigned its source to, and then he nodded. He grabbed his toolkit. The tower radio crackled through the speakers, the aircraft's voice breaking into fragments and reassembling. Iron Cliff Tower cargo flight, read you broken fuel tightening requesting priority guidance. The duty lieutenant looked at his manual. He looked at Keating. The screens blinked. Nobody moved. In the stillness of that half-second, Claire stepped forward. Reroute tower traffic to frequency 325. Now. Her voice was flat and certain, carrying no excess weight. Hollins, the backup antenna chain physically. Every connection from relay to tower input. Voss needs to be on the phone immediately. We need a generator line to this building before the next voltage dip. And the effect was instantaneous and complete. Hollins moved. The lieutenant reached for the frequency controls. An airman reached for the phone to Voss. A second airman began the manual vehicle tracking confirmation calls. The duty officer found his voice and reached for the tower line. One voice from the back of the room, hesitant. Ma'am, changing the approach frequency without... The tower has multiband capability, Claire said. She was already at the console, not displacing the airman seated there, but directing him here, this control, this configuration. 325 is within the aircraft's onboard preset range, and it's a clean band. The current channel is compromised. Call the tower. From the doorway where she did not look, the sound of a second set of footsteps arriving and then going still. Gerald Strand had come to the communications hub because the storm had made the administrative building loud with urgency, and he had followed the urgency to its source the way people with reasons to pay attention to institutional crises follow them. He stood in the doorway and he heard what he heard. Frequency 325 did not appear in any public procedures manual. It appeared in classified Pacific Fleet Strike Group protocols used for alternate approach communications during compromised channel situations in contested or degraded environments. He had served under 3 flag officers who had used it. He had heard it called out with exactly this kind of flat reflexive certainty by exactly the kind of voice that has issued orders in darkness and carried the outcomes of those orders forward and kept issuing orders. He understood what he was listening to before his conscious mind had found the language for it. He did not make a sound. He stepped back from the doorway and walked down the corridor at a pace that was controlled because he was a controlled man, even now, even with the full shape of the week rearranging itself in his understanding with the cold clarity of a man who recognizes too late the operation he has been standing inside. In the comm hub, the frequency shift worked. The tower feed cleared. The aircraft's voice came through with the sudden resolution of a signal that has found its path, present, coherent, close. Iron Cliff Tower cargo flight on 325, reading you 5x5. Hollins's voice on the internal line. He had found the corroded junction in the backup antenna chain, bypassed it, load was redistributing. The screens began shifting from red toward amber. Voss and his team arrived at the building with a portable generator in the rain, moving with the efficiency of men who have been given clear instructions and a reason to follow them without qualification. At 22:47, the tower reported wheels down, runway clear. The room exhaled, the sound of collective tension releasing shapeless, human reel. Someone started to applaud and the room completed it. Claire took off the headset and gave it back to the duty lieutenant. Make sure the tower logs the full record of tonight. Frequency change, weather, impact system failure, sequence of events. The real record, not the cleaned up version. Somebody up the chain needs to understand what actually happened in this room. He was still looking at her with the expression of a man trying to locate a face in a catalog he is certain it belongs in. Keating appeared at her shoulder. She began a sentence and stopped. She looked at Claire the way a person looks at something they have been close to for 5 days and are only now seeing fully. When she spoke, she didn't finish the question because somewhere in the asking, she recognized that she already had enough of the answer. How did you? We had worse in the Gulf, Claire said. Different frequency. Same problem, good people in a failing system trying to do the right thing without the conditions to do it. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd left it on arrival. I just don't like watching that end badly. She walked out into the rain. Strand moved quickly with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed this contingency. He returned to the supply office and opened his personal laptop. He deleted files, the internal routing documentation linking him to the diversion decisions, the correspondence that named the destination, address, the approval records that predated the digital tracking system's introduction. Not all of it. Some lived in systems he couldn't reach from here. But enough. He believed he had purchased room. Then he took the second phone from the credenza and composed a message to the contact saved only as the letter W. The message was brief and used language they had established for this kind of communication. It described a possible embedded assessment on the base, requested that routing records be cleared on the receiving end, expressed confidence in the ability to manage the situation. He sent it at 1:03 in the morning. He sat in the quiet office and looked at the sent message and made the mistake that careful men make after long runs of success. The mistake of believing that the actions available to him now were proportionate to the threat that actually existed. He was thinking about what he had done. He was not thinking about what had already been done around him. Across the base in the logistics building, in the corner of the room that had become hers through the simple application of consistent presence and late hours, Claire sat at a desk and looked at a small device that was not a government-issued phone. At 1:09 in the morning, it showed her 7 words. She read them. She set the device face down. She was quiet for a moment. She took out the civilian notebook and opened it to the page that was otherwise blank and wrote 3 lines. The room was empty and the building was quiet except for the ventilation system cycling and the rain on the windows diminishing, now the storm spending its last energy against the glass without conviction. People who had known Claire Donovan in other contexts on the bridge of a carrier, in command centers, lit red in the rooms in Washington, where the decisions that don't appear in press releases get made, said consistent things about her when they were asked. They said she was difficult to read under pressure. They said she asked better questions than most people ask themselves. And they said this when she stopped talking and took out the notebook, the decision was made. Not the plan would come, but the thing before the plan, the irreversible commitment that everything else follows from. That had already happened. Writing it down was how she acknowledged it to herself. She wrote the 3 lines, closed the notebook, returned it to the duffel. She looked at the list she had assembled mentally over 5 days, not the evidence, not the operational picture, but the personal one. Walsh, 22 years old, almost lost to a system that had mistaken his competence for failure. Hollins, 19 years of service, writing the separation paperwork in the back of his mind. Voss, standing in the rain at midnight for a system that had systematically failed to stand behind him. And Keating, who had been holding this place together by the force of a belief that it was worth holding, and who had something specific she had not yet said, something that lived in the 2 pauses Claire had noticed in 2 separate conversations. The pause of a person who has said a thing before into silence and has decided the silence means the saying is finished. It was not finished. Claire would confirm that in the morning. She stood and picked up the duffel and walked out of the building for the last time as a logistics transfer clerk. The storm was nearly gone. The Virginia night was clean, the air stripped of everything inessential smelling of salt, and the waterlogged earth of a coast that had been thoroughly reorganized by weather. The harbor below held its lights in the still water, steady and clear. She drove to her temporary quarters and did not turn on the lights. She stood at the window for a while, not at rest exactly, but at the still center of a thing she had built carefully over 5 days, and that was now in its final hours, as complete as she could make it. She lay down on the bed with the boots still on and closed her eyes. In 7 hours, the ceremony would begin. At 0600, she found Keating in the logistics office with coffee and a tablet and the expression of someone working through the morning's first problems before the morning gave them anything worse. Keating looked up. She looked at Claire the way she had been looking at her since the comm hub, with the recalibrating attention of someone whose picture of a situation is shifting in ways she has not yet named. Claire sat across from her. She placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. A printed summary, not official, not stamped, not attributable. A clean factual account of 18 months of supply chain anomalies organized by date and value and destination code. Keating looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "You found the same thing I found," she said. "When did you file your report?" The pause was the pause of someone deciding how much to trust and then deciding. 6 months ago, through the IG process. What happened after? I was told it was under review. 3 months later, I was informally told to stand down. That it had been elevated and was being handled at a higher level. She looked at the window. It was not being handled. "No," Claire said, "it was not." Keating looked at the numbers on the page. She was not reading them, she knew them. She was looking at them the way you look at a thing that has been true for a long time and has just been confirmed by someone else seeing it, which is different from knowing it alone. "What happens now?" she said. "Tomorrow, something changes." Claire stood. At the door, she looked back. "Make sure you're at formation at 0800. and keep the copy of everything you filed. All of it, somewhere off government systems. It's been there for 6 months, Keating said quietly. Claire nodded. She walked out into the hallway that was beginning to fill with the first sounds of the base waking and went to her temporary quarters and opened the duffel and took out the dress whites that had been folded at the bottom since Norfolk. She laid them on the bed. The Admiral's stars on the collar caught the morning light coming through the window, honest, specific, telling the truth in the plain language of metal. She sat on the edge of the bed and removed the boots. She held the left one for a moment, the Risold toe, the Pacific and the right heel's scar. She set them on the floor side by side with the deliberateness of someone setting something down when one kind of work is finished and another is about to begin. She would not need them today. The storm left Virginia the way honest reckoning always leaves, not gently, not with apology, but completely. The sky that came after it was the blue of a world that has been thoroughly reorganized, deeper and cleaner than ordinary October blue, the color of air that had surrendered everything that was inessential and was now presenting its actual self. Nass Ironcliffe assembled in that light with the precision that military ceremony requires and the particular human weight of an institution that does not yet know what it is assembling for. Boots found the parade ground asphalt in the rhythmic consolidation of formation, individual movement resolving into collective form, the flag lines snapping in a wind that still carried the storm's residual energy without its malice. The brass section of the bass band laid down the ceremonial march, and the sound moved across the harbor and came back changed by distance. Through the ranks, the rumors were still running. The logistics transfer had not come in that morning. Her desk was empty, her guest account logged out, her duffel gone from beneath the chair where it had lived for 7 days. Nobody had seen her leave. The absence was noticed immediately in the way of closed communities where a consistent presence and its sudden removal are felt as a change in atmospheric pressure rather than a simple missing person. The explanation offered was incomplete, by design a change of command ceremony. An incoming admiral from Washington. Young, tactical, the kind of officer about whom the word prodigy gets used in the same way that people use words they've received secondhand without fully examining. Captain Harlow adjusted his dress cap and said to the man beside him that they probably sent another paper-smart reformer who'd never had to move a unit in actual field conditions. The man beside him laughed in the way of someone who agreed less than the laugh suggested. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood near the front of the officer formation with his spine correct and his face composed, and had been standing there since arriving 9 minutes early, which was not his habit. He had been in his office at 0500, not because he had work that required it, though there was always work, but because he had been unable to sleep with the quality of attention that had been growing in him since the previous evening when he had heard what happened in the comm hub and understood in the way that precise information produces precise understanding that the week he thought he had been managing had been something else entirely. Danny Voss was at the motor pool fence line, which was not where the formation put him. He stood with one hand on the chain link and watched the parade ground with the expression of a man connecting things that were resisting final connection. He was thinking about a woman who had stood in his bay with requisition forms and had not flinched when he informed her of the limits of her operational understanding. He was thinking about what she had said in response. He was thinking about the rain the previous night and how fast he had moved when the call came and why he had moved that fast and whether the reason had been the words or something underneath the words. Ray Holland stood in the comm hub doorway. He had been there since 0500 running the restored systems through their morning verification checks. The numbers were the best his section had posted in over a year. He kept returning to the moment she had told him to check the antenna chain physically, not on the screen. The understanding underneath that instruction. That diagnostics are interpretations, and interpretations have limits, and the only thing that is not an interpretation is what your hands find when you look directly at the physical thing. He had been submitting parts requests for 6 months. He had been told in various forms of official language that his section was stable. The previous night had demonstrated with clinical precision what stable had actually meant. Sarah Keating stood in the front row of the officer formation, where her rank placed her, holding herself with the controlled posture of someone exercising conscious management over a body that would prefer a different response to what is coming. She had not fully slept. She had spent the hours between 0600 and 0730 turning over the shape of a week that had been something other than what it appeared, and arriving at the same destination from each new angle. A woman had sat across from her this morning and placed a piece of paper between them, and the paper contained the same numbers Keating had organized into an IG complaint 6 months ago, And the woman who placed it there had known about that complaint before Keating told her, and the woman had said tomorrow something changes with the particular quality of certainty that belongs to statements about things that have already been arranged. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. The formation settled. The announcement came the formal language of military ceremony, the structured invocation of authority being transferred the declaration of what was about to happen. Every head in the formation turned toward the main entrance of the parade ground, which was the designated approach, the correct ceremonial path, the direction you looked for an incoming flag officer. The main entrance remained empty. 4 seconds, 5. The slight wrongness of an expectation that has failed to be met, the recalibration the brain performs when the world declines to present itself in the order that was prepared. Then from the eastern perimeter road. Not the ceremonial path, not where you looked. The maintenance access road that ran along the eastern edge of the parade ground, used by early shift vehicles and logistics personnel, unremarkable by design. From that road, a figure stepped into the full October morning sun. The dress whites caught the light the way things catch light when they have been earned rather than assigned, not reflecting it but meeting it something specific and settled rather than incidental. Every decoration in its correct position, with the precision of a person who has worn this uniform for 16 years and has achieved correctness without calculation. The Admiral's stars on the collar held the morning light and gave it back. She walked onto the parade ground at the pace of someone who has arrived where they always intended to arrive, from the direction they intended to come from at the moment they intended. Not the ceremonial path, because this was not primarily for her a ceremony. It was the next step in a sequence that had begun 7 mornings ago at a gate where a corporal had waved her through a barrier without reading her name. The recognition moved through the formation from front to back as a wave hitting people at slightly different moments, depending on their angle and their distance, and the speed at which their particular reconstruction of the past week completed itself. Keating reached it first. She was in the front row, already watching, already holding the nearly complete picture, and then the light found the stars, and the picture finished itself. And the sound that came out of her was involuntary and unguarded, the exhalation of a person whose entire body has confirmed what their mind had been afraid to conclude. Oh my God. At the motor pool fence, Voss stopped connecting things and simply received the completed picture all at once. The wrench in his right hand was forgotten. He was thinking about a rear admiral of the United States Navy standing in his bay while he explained to her what rookies should and should not do. Hollins from the comm hub doorway felt the release of sustained, incomplete understanding, the physical relief of a picture revealing what it was. He had been holding the explanation with missing pieces since the moment the frequency 325 call cut through the noise of the failing comm hub. The missing pieces were no longer missing. Corporal Decker, at the gate post where he had been assigned for ceremony detail, went rigid in the way that happens when the nervous system processes information faster than the conscious mind. His right hand came up in a salute that was not ceremonially timed and not ceremonially angled, and was the most genuinely felt gesture he had produced in 3 months of service. His eyes were bright in the way of eyes behind which something larger than the face has room for his pressing forward. He was thinking about an ID card he had held in his hand and returned without reading, about a pair of battered boots crossing a gate he controlled, about what he had missed and what it meant that she had known the full weight of what she was walking into and had walked into it anyway in jeans carrying a duffel bag. The announcer, finding his professional register after a moment's gap, "Ladies and gentlemen, Rear Admiral Claire Donovan, assuming command of Naval Air Station Ironcliff." She walked to the podium at the same pace she had walked everything this week. When she reached it, she stood without speaking for a moment and looked at the formation, not performing the look, not managing it, actually looking with the quality of attention she had brought to every room she entered all week. The same faces she had passed in hallways and logistics offices and motor pool bays and communications hubs, some of them now visibly recalculating the architecture of the past 7 days. When she spoke, her voice carried across the field without the mechanical assistance of projection. It carried because there was no gap between the person and the words. "I spent my first week here as a transfer clerk." The silence that followed was not the trained silence of a formation standing at attention. It was the silence of 1,000 people hearing a sentence they were not prepared to hear. No rank, no uniform, just a name on a piece of paper and a guest account login. She paused. "I wanted to see this installation the way you see it every day, when no one important is watching." She let that settle. Then quieter. "Turns out something important is always watching. You are." A longer pause. "I saw frustration. I saw systems that made good people look like they were failing when the system itself had failed them. I saw equipment waiting for signatures that never came. I saw a communications hub held together by one sergeant's refusal to accept that barely functional was the same as operational. She looked toward Hollins. Last night I watched what that refusal was worth. She looked back to the formation. But I saw something else. I saw people who still cared, people who fixed what they could when the system wasn't watching, people who filed the reports that needed to be filed even when filing produced silence, people who kept showing up. The movement through the formation was not visible in individual faces. It was collective, the particular shift of an institution recognizing itself in a description it was not prepared to recognize. Major Sarah Keating, front and center. Keating marched forward with the controlled precision of someone who has decided the emotional content of this moment will be processed on her own time and not on this field. She stopped at the correct distance. Her salute was sharp. This officer has held this command's logistics function together through 18 months of systemic failure and active obstruction. She filed the reports that were supposed to be filed. She did not stop when those reports went into silence. Claire's voice did not change and register. She will lead our logistics reform task force effective immediately. The applause started before it was cued, which is the only applause that means anything. Keating's composure held at the surface. The brightness in her eyes did not. She returned to formation with the walk of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just learned that the carrying was witnessed. Staff Sergeant Danny Voss. Voss came off the fence line at a pace that was faster than regulation and did not care. He stopped at the correct distance. His salute was sharp and his hands were as clean as he had been able to make them, which still retained the faint ghost of grease at the knuckle creases, which was simply who he was and not something a ceremony could revise. When the storm came last night, this man did not wait for orders. He came out in the worst of it because the mission required it, and he understood that before anyone told him. She looked at him. He will oversee our base-wide maintenance optimization program, and the 3 vehicles that have been sitting in his lot with their hoods open since before I arrived will have their parts requisitions honored by end of business Friday. The movement across Voss's face was not something he had budgeted for. His voice, when he found it, was level. Yes, ma'am. The salute he threw carried something that salutes don't always carry, the gratitude of a man who has just been given back something he had stopped expecting to receive. Sergeant First Class Ray Hollins. Hollins stepped forward with the posture of a man who has served long enough to have learned patience as a practice and has just discovered that the practice produced something after all. His salute was correct. His smile broke his professional composure in the all involuntary way of a person who has been working in the dark for a long time and has just felt the light find them. This sergeant kept this base's voice alive last night when the systems around him failed. He will head our new technical integrity initiative, and his communications hub will receive full equipment replacement beginning next week. Hollins lowered his salute with the deliberateness of a man marking a moment. Claire turned back to the full formation. These 3 did not wait for permission to do the right thing. They acted, they spoke, they kept caring after the environment stopped making caring easy. A pause. That is what this command will look like from this day forward. Not performance, not the version you prepare when someone important is watching, the version you are when you believe no one is. The words landed on the parade ground and stayed. From this day on, we fix problems before they become excuses. It was in the long breath that followed in the seconds before the ceremony moved to its formal elements that the 2 figures detached from the outer edge of the security detail. They wore civilian clothes, they had valid credentials, they had been on the installation since the morning after Claire's second day working a maintenance inspection of the hangar base systems. They had done genuine maintenance work. Between the maintenance work, they had done the other work, building the evidentiary record from the documentation Claire had identified, cross-referencing against the financial trail, confirming the chain of authorization that ran from the Norfolk Air address up through the supply section to a Pentagon office in the Logistics Oversight Division. Captain Gerald Strand saw them from 40 feet. He did not run. There was nowhere to run on a parade ground at a change of command ceremony with 1,000 witnesses and 2 NCIS agents moving toward him with the calm of people who have been waiting for this specific moment and have confirmed its arrival. The intelligence that had served him well for 18 months was the intelligence of a careful man operating in conditions that rewarded care. These conditions rewarded nothing except standing still and accepting what was coming. One agent, Captain Strand, please come with us. The handcuffs went on at the edge of the formation with the minimum of visible disruption because the agents were professionals who understood that the fact of it was sufficient and theater added nothing. Webb saw it. His face showed nothing. His eyes moved from Strand to the podium and back, performing an accounting that took less than 3 seconds and produced a reckoning that would take considerably longer to fully process. Keating saw it and kept her eyes forward because she had been waiting for it in the way of someone who filed paperwork 6 months ago and is finally watching the paperwork produce its result. The formal elements of the ceremony concluded with the correct military efficiency. The outgoing commander performed the handover, the flags transferred hands. The band played the Navy hymn, and the sound moved across the harbor, and the ships at berth received it. As the formation dismissed, Webb made his way through the dispersing crowd to where Claire stood. He did not make a speech because the moment called for something that was not a speech. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the direct attention of a man who was doing accounting rather than performing an interaction. Then he brought his right hand up in a salute. It was not required. The ceremony was over. The salute was therefore entirely voluntary and therefore entirely real, the salute of a man acknowledging without the cushion of protocol the full weight of a week during which he had assigned a rear admiral to a logistics desk without fully reading her name. She returned it. "Oh, 900, she said. "Bring the readiness metrics for the past 6 months. The real numbers." "Yes, ma'am." He walked toward headquarters with the walk of a man who has just added something significant to his understanding of his own failure and has decided to use that understanding rather than be destroyed by it. The office that had been the outgoing commander's was spare and functional, with the harbor visible through the east window. She sat across from Keating for the second time in less than 3 hours, but the context had been entirely transformed, the difference between a picture being assembled and a picture fully seen. Hollins was there, and Voss and two NCIS agents at the edge of the room with the attentive neutrality of professionals in the documentation phase of an operation. The debrief was methodical. Claire led it through the factual record, the destination codes in Walsh's supply data, the routing patterns. Brackett and Marlowe transferred within 72 hours of filing. The intercepted message at 1:03 in the morning sent to the contact saved as W. When the factual record was covered, Keating spoke. She had been holding it with the particular stillness of someone waiting for the right point in a conversation. Now she arrived at it. "I need to say something for the record." Everyone looked at her. 6 months ago, I filed an Inspector General complaint about supply chain routing anomalies. I had destination code discrepancies, timeline irregularities, and a partial financial trail. The complaint was acknowledged. I was told it was under review. She paused. 3 months later, I was told informally to stand down, that it had been elevated and was being handled. Her voice was level. It was not being handled. I kept a copy of everything I filed. At home, not on any government system. Because by that point, I understood that government systems were not safe for this particular information. One of the NCIS agents had a notebook open. "Your complaint was intercepted before it reached standard IG processing," Claire said. "It was flagged and removed from the review queue by Rear Admiral Whitmore, Pentagon Logistics Oversight. His involvement is documented in the evidence the NCIS team has been building this week. A federal arrest order for Whitmore is being executed this morning." The room absorbed this. The full vertical extent of what had been operating from a supply captain's office at NAS Ironcliff up through a Pentagon Admiral's oversight function was now visible in its entirety, and the visibility of it after months in which the parts had been present, but the whole had been obscured, produced a specific quality of silence. Voss said something under his breath that was not appropriate for the record and was accurate. Keating looked at the window. Then she looked at Claire. "My complaint was buried for 6 months. "Yes." "And you found it?" "On day 2, searching personnel records for prior complaints about the supply section. Your documentation was thorough. It was one of the things that confirmed the pattern." Keating absorbed that the fact that the report she had filed into what felt like institutional silence had been found, had mattered, had become part of the structure of something that was now producing consequences. Not wasted, rerouted through a channel she hadn't known existed to someone who knew how to use what she had built. "Submit your complete copies to the NCIS case file," Claire said. "Full documentation, everything you kept." "Yes, ma'am." The agents finished their notes and were dismissed. Hollins and Voss left for their sections, which were waiting for them with the energy of organizations that had understood something fundamental had changed and were ready to work inside that change. When the room had cleared to just the two of them, Keating stood to leave and stopped at the door. You filed that complaint, Claire said before Keating could speak, when there was no evidence, anyone was watching, and no obvious reward for it. When Strand had cover above his level, and you had no way of knowing whether anything you filed would survive the filing. She held Keating's eyes. That is what leadership looks like when the system has stopped supporting it. You didn't need a witness to do it, but you had one. Keating stood with that for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but settled the way faces settle when they have been given back something they had not consciously realized they needed. 0800 tomorrow, Claire said. Preliminary framework for the Reform Task Force. We start before the week is out. Keating nodded. She left with the walk of someone who has been given a direction and the authority to move in it and knows the difference between that and what came before. 6 months moved through Nass Ironcliff. The way weather moves through a place that has forgotten what good weather feels like, not with drama, but with the gradual disclosure of what the place had always been capable of being. The logistics chain was the first thing fixed in a way that held. Keating's task force worked through the backlogs with the organized intensity of people who have been pointed toward a problem they understand and given the authority to address it without permission at every step. Within 60 days, the requisition timeline had halved. Within 90, it had reached a standard that other commands began requesting as a model. Keating fielded those calls with the brevity of someone too occupied doing the work to spend time describing it. Voss's motor pool reached regional fleet readiness leader status in the 4th month. The 3 vehicles that had been sitting with their hoods open on Claire's first morning were running. The parts that had been diverted through Strand's operation and had finally arrived through legitimate channels were installed and logged. Voss ran his readiness briefings with the authority that belongs to someone who has always had the expertise and now has a position that matches it. He did not become diplomatic. He became more useful than he had been when diplomacy was his only available instrument. Hollands's comm hub posted 100% operational uptime for 5 consecutive months. The equipment that had been running on salvaged components and the refusal of one sergeant to accept failure as a final state was replaced systematically component by component through a procurement process that now had clean documentation and no intercepted requests. His technicians trusted the equipment. More importantly, they trusted the chain of command above it, which is a different thing and less easily repaired when broken. Aaron Walsh became the section system training lead. The seaman who had arrived at a transfer clerk's desk with the expression of a man drowning spent 3 months untangling every cascading error in the transition database, and the work gave him something the errors had taken the confidence of a person who understands a system thoroughly enough to explain it to someone who doesn't. He was patient at the explaining in the way of people who have been on the wrong side of an inexplicable system and have not forgotten what that was like. Gerald Strand was court-martialed in the 3rd month. The trial was not long. The documentation was complete, and the chain of evidence was clean, and the sentence was read into the record in a courtroom that had the quality of rooms where institutional accountability is performed without ornament, not satisfying exactly, but necessary and recognized as necessary by everyone who attended. Rear Admiral Whitmore was removed from his Pentagon post within 48 hours of the change of command ceremony and placed under federal investigation, which produced over 4 months, 3 additional referrals for prosecution officers at various levels of the logistics oversight function who had possessed sufficient awareness of the diversion operation to have acted and had chosen not to, which is its own category of culpability. The financial recovery hardware traced through the Norfolk facility inventory reconciled value returned to Department of Defense accounts came to slightly over $3 million. The number Claire returned to was not $3 million. It was the number of units that had been waiting on equipment while it sat in a civilian warehouse. It was 6 months of Hollands's parts requests. It was Voss's 3 vehicles. It was a seaman who had nearly left the Navy because a bad training document had been allowed to masquerade as his incompetence for 2 weeks without anyone checking whether the map matched the road. Those numbers don't appear in financial recovery reports. They appear in the condition of a base 6 months after someone walked through its gate at dawn in jeans and old boots without announcing what she was, and looked at what it actually was. She walked the base most mornings before the day's first meeting. Not inspection in the formal sense, something more like attendance. The difference between a place as it performs itself and a place as it actually is. The difference at Ironcliff had narrowed to something close to honest, which is the best that human institutions achieve, and not nothing. She was in her office one afternoon in the 6th month when her assistant appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who has found something they're uncertain the relevance of. "Ma'am, the storage closet off the main hallway. I'm clearing out items from the administrative transition. There are some things left behind. She held up the boots. Left boot resoled toe, right boot scar at the heel from a ship's deck, cleats somewhere in the Western Pacific. They had dried after the storm night, and the leather had stiffened at the flex points, and there was a faint waterline at the ankle of the right boot where the rain had come in. 7 days of Virginia in October. 3 oceans before that. The distance they carried was in them the way distance is in things that have actually gone the milestone rather than been told to. Claire looked at them for a moment. The full weight of the week they represented, not the ceremony, not the arrest, not the 6 months of work that followed, but the specific quality of the decision to arrive at a gate looking like nobody important to walk through the institution as it actually was, rather than as it would have presented itself to earn the trust of people who would never have offered it on the basis of rank alone. "No," she said, "leave them." Her assistant returned them to the shelf in the closet and went back to her work. Claire returned to hers. The boots remained where they were, not as trophies, not as decoration, but as the record of a method, of a belief about how authority works when it works honestly, which is from the ground up rather than the top down, from knowledge rather than position, from what you are willing to find out when no one is watching rather than what you are willing to claim when everyone is. The harbor outside was doing what the harbor did in the late afternoon, receiving the light at a different angle than the morning. The ships at berth steady in the water, the cranes moving. She turned back to her desk. There is a question that stays with you after a story like this, and it is not the simple one. The simple question: was the criminal caught? Was the damage repaired? Were the good people recognized? Has answers, and the answers are yes, and they are documented in the official record. The question that stays is harder. It is the question of the distance between what we say our institutions are and what we are willing to walk through the gate in the early morning without ceremony and without announcement to actually discover. It is the question of how many systems we trust right now are operating the way NAS Ironcliff operated, not through dramatic failure, but through the slow normalization of damage, the quiet adjustment of expectations until the adjusted expectation becomes the floor, until the people inside it have stopped noticing the ceiling has lowered. And it is the question of how many Aaron Walshes are at their desks tonight staying late believing the map they were given rather than questioning whether the map matches the road. Claire Donovan understood something about power that most people in positions of authority are never required to learn, that the power which announces itself first controls only what it can see from where it stands, and what it cannot see is always larger than what it can. She had walked through that gate looking like nobody important. That was not humility. That was method. That was the whole point.